Good evening, everyone. My name's Rhiannon Wright. I'm a program manager with CADE. Tonight, we're focusing on food safety regulations and agencies. We have Cynthia James from the Cornell Food Venture Center here. She is a wealth of knowledge and is going to be a shining light through some very dense material tonight. So rest assured, we will share a copy of the slides with everybody. There's going to be a lot of info and a lot of it is more reference. So you can stay tuned. We'll send out the recording of the webinar and all of those associated materials sometime next week. Okay, so as always, we're going to start with a land acknowledgement. CADE's offices are located in Oneonta, New York, near the headwaters of the Susquehanna River. These lands have been tended to for thousands of years by the people of the Mohawk and Oneida nations, who are both members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The name Oneonta is original to the Mohawk language and means place of open rocks. The government of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is the oldest continuous democracy on Earth, which I learned from rematriation.com, which is a digital storytelling platform led by Haudenosaunee women. Native-land.ca is a great, easy-to-use website if you are not familiar with whose land you're on. There are lots of ways to honor their legacy. You can learn about place names and practices and stories and the history of how the land was stolen. You can visit their tribal websites and see what they're up to today. We know that these are not nations that are just gone. They are still active sovereign nations. So on the screen are the two main tribal groups that are native to our land, but the native-land.ca website will point you to the folks' website that is for people who are your land. A story of local significance that we would like to hold up is the Waterfall Unity Alliance. They are a group that was formed in 2015 by Mohawk leaders who returned to Schoharie, just up the road from where I am in Jefferson, to stand with local residents against the Constitution Pipeline, which was a major fracked gas pipeline that was planned to go across the whole of upstate New York. That was a great, successful local grassroots story, and it's wonderful to read on their website. And they're doing continual fundraising. They just bought a few weeks or months ago a like 60-acre berry farm in Schoharie, and they're going to be having it as a community space and a functioning farm. So they are doing ongoing fundraising at that GoFundMe. We would love to hear where you're coming from in the chat. We are increasingly seeing lots of folks from across the state, so would love to see where you all are coming from to help us get oriented as a group. All right, next up, we will put the community agreements in the chat. Lots of words on this slide, but we, we're in a communal learning environment today. We don't have so much interaction with each other in these settings, but this is kind of our framework for just having a thoughtful, humble, playful learning environment. So please check those out in the chat, and we love to hear if you have any suggestions for updates on those. So happy to hear that as well. So CADE, if you're not so familiar with our services, we were founded in 1991. So we've easily been saying, oh, we've been around for 30 years for the past 2 years, but now it's more like 32 years. We provide services to farm and food businesses across New York State. We have these two main buckets of resource sharing and one-on-one technical assistance. So we have a great resource library and have lots of freely available public learning opportunities, but we also do one-on-one work with clients. So you can work individually with James, Caitlin, and I on any of the topics in those purple circles, from access to capital to marketing and land access. We all have our own area of expertise on the program team and are happy to work with you one-on-one as well. Okay, so can now introduce Cynthia. Oh, sorry, one more. Here's CADE staff. We're a small and mighty team of 6. Phoebe, Wendy, and Karen hold it down on the back end doing our admin and finance work and communications. And then Caitlin, James, and I, like I said, are the program team. Okay, so food safety and regulatory compliance. This is mainly James's area of expertise for CADE. So if you were working with us one-on-one on that, James would be your point person. We basically are just here and happy to help you know what questions you need to ask about food safety and where you can go to find the right information and what person at Ag and Markets you need to talk to, and just kind of start to talk through things with you individually about your product and food safety questions. In a recent survey that we did to our clients, production related needs were one of the highest priorities that we saw from folks. So we know that this is something that you all are needing information on. So hoping that tonight is helpful, and you can please not hesitate to reach out to James. Any of us, it's just our first name at cadefarms.org to reach us via email. So you're welcome to reach out to him. Okay, so I am ready to introduce Cynthia. Cynthia, just like me, is from Reading, Pennsylvania. We both grew up in Reading and relocated to the Finger Lakes with her family in 2017. As an extension support specialist at the Cornell Food Venture Center, Cynthia works with the Process Authority in helping to validate value-added packaged food products for safety and stability, and consults with manufacturers about the steps they need to take to bring a safe product to market. Cynthia also managed the content development and currently facilitates the online food product development certificate programs. That's an online course through eCornell, which covers product ideation, food safety and quality, packaging and processing, regulatory compliance, and commercialization. So A to Z there. She has been involved in the development of several other online and in-person educational programs, including current good manufacturing practices and regulatory requirements for small food processors. She has tons of experience with HACCP, process control, and does lots of education. We are thrilled to have her expertise in the room. So welcome, Cynthia. I can pass it over to you.
Thank you, Rhiannon. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. I have farming experience, so I'm completely familiar with that end of it too. So I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, there we go. Everyone can see that, okay? Okay, great. Okay, so we're going to be talking about food safety regulations and agencies today. It is a very dense program, and it's mostly, we're talking about value-added products. So not so much fresh produce or fresh meats, but sort of what happens next, and how you get those to market safely, and kind of navigating this regulatory landscape from a local, state, and also federal perspective, because it can be really overwhelming and a lot. So I work at the Food Venture Center, as Rhiannon mentioned, and our mission is to provide technical assistance to farmers, entrepreneurs, and food companies that are pursuing new food products for the marketplace, especially related to food safety and economic development. It started in 1988 under the leadership of Dr. Don Downing. And just to give you kind of an idea of our scope, in 2021, we had over 7,000 requests for assistance. About 750 businesses received safety validations for their products. And we analyzed over 3,000 samples of products and approved more than 2,200 food products. So one of the main things that we do talk about here is that we're a process authority service. So a processing authority is a person or an institution that has expert knowledge and experience and the facilities to determine the safety of a food process and formulation. So, and it really comes from experience. There's not like a certificate or something like that. It's really over the course of experience. Processing authorities come to be known to be trusted for their knowledge. And often we get people a lot of times who their facilities are inspected by NYSDAM, by Ag and Markets, and If they're not sure about the safety of their product, the first thing they'll tell them is to call Cornell to have their product reviewed. And basically analyze and review and validate their product for safety and stability. So especially if your product is shelf stable, the inspector is going to ask you to get either they'll call it a product review or a scheduled process. And what that is a formal document that validates the safety and stability of your product. For shelf stable products, it's extremely important. And we'll go into kind of what that means further on in this presentation. But essentially it's a product that does not need refrigeration to be safe. So that's why a safety review is much more important, because you don't have that refrigeration that's going to prevent microbes for spoilage or pathogens that could help make your could contribute to your product not being safe. So that's one of the major things that we do is we review, create scheduled processes, and that can be for fruits and vegetables, also for meats. We also looked at cured meats. We do sometimes get requests for refrigerated and frozen products. Those have, inherent safety built in just in their storage, qualities. But sometimes inspectors will ask for those products to be reviewed if they're not familiar with them or the process. Reduced oxygen packaged foods, those are things like vacuum packed products, and also a deviation assessment. So that is if something is out of specification for safety. If you've come to us for a safety validation and you're making your product and it's out of specification, say maybe you didn't heat it to the right temperature or the pH wasn't quite right, you can give us your records to assess to see if we can actually clear your product as safe or whether you really have to destroy it. So it's a very helpful service that we provide for sure, because it could save you a lot of money and a lot of energy. And product classification letters. So we'll go into each of these a little bit more as we move on. But just to give you an idea, a little bit about what the Food Venture Center does. We also have, a pilot plant here in Geneva. We're located in Geneva at Cornell Agritech. And this food processing plant is fantastic. It's about 10,000 square feet. It's mostly for plant-based products, so fruits and vegetables. We don't do meats in there or dairy. But it's great, especially if you are a small processor, maybe you're using a small commercial kitchen, you're becoming really successful, but you don't know what to do to scale up. Maybe you need different type of equipment, maybe your ingredients are going to shift over. The pilot plant is the perfect place to kind of experiment with that. It's not really meant as a production facility, it's more for research and development, and we have a fantastic technological team, tech support team there as well that can help you make some decisions on some of these things before you then would maybe take your product to either a larger facility or a co-packer, but it's a really great resource. Okay, so we're going to talk today about food preservation and food safety, what kind of hazards and factors influence microbial growth, which could make your product unsafe, what product classifications means to the FDA and to other regulators, controls for microorganism growth and pathogens. We're going to talk about critical factors and scheduled processes, regulatory requirements as they're related to different foods, and then we're going to look at the Food Safety Modernization Act and what that includes as well. Okay, so first, food preservation, what is that? That's really extending the life of a food product by avoiding spoilage and safety concerns, mostly due to microbial and quality changes. And the way that we do that is by eliminating, excluding, or inhibiting the growth of microorganisms. So we have to control these conditions that compromise our food quality. So we'll talk about now how to do that. So the major contaminants and hazards in food safety are physical, chemical, or biological. So physical things could be like any small piece of any kind of physical contaminant that could be big enough to cause injury or illness. So it could be a piece of wood, it could be like pits from fruits or bones, or metal or plastic from something else. Chemical contaminants could be cleaning compounds, or the most common chemical contaminant is actually allergens. So because allergens can cause a severe effect in people who have allergies, if a product has been exposed to an allergen during production or handling, that could be a serious chemical hazard and cause anaphylactic shock or even death to someone who has a specific allergen. And biological contaminants are a lot of what we deal with here at the Food Venture Center. How do we prevent bacteria and parasites and viruses in your food products to make them safe? Okay, so here are microorganisms. So there's two main kinds of microorganisms that we're talking about. The first kind is pathogens, and that's a kind of biological hazard that actually makes people sick, either by eating the organism directly, or some organisms actually create a toxin just through their multiplication in the product. And even if you kill the bacteria or the microorganism, the toxin still may be present and cause illness. So Clostridium botulinum is one of those organisms that can do that. That's one of the most deadliest organisms that we're most concerned about when we're talking about food safety. And we'll talk a little bit more about that further on. Whereas spoilage microorganisms don't make you sick, but they definitely can produce something that's a quality concern. So usually we're talking about yeasts and molds here, also bacteria. So when you see like, mold, like bread that's been out for too long, it starts to grow mold on it. That's a quality concern, but you wouldn't get sick if you were to eat that bread with a little bit of mold on it. But both of those things are really important from an economic standpoint, for sure. So the factors that affect microbial growth, we use this little mnemonic device called FAT-TOM to remember all of the things that can affect microbial growth. So we're talking about food. Microbes need food to grow, which if you're making food, there's food. Acidity, so microbes prefer a less acidic environment. So more low acid products are going to be more prone to bacterial and microbial growth. If you have a high acid product, it's going to be inherently more safe and actually easier to make shelf stable. So temperature is also a factor. So in that kind of room temperature, it's a little bit warmer, even 70 to 120. That's when microbes are going to grow the fastest. Refrigerated conditions, they're going to not stop growing, but they'll slow down quite a bit. Whereas freezing conditions, they'll completely stop growing until you get back into that nice temperature zone again. And again, you get to boiling temperatures and you can, all of these microorganisms are going to die as well in that. So temperature is very important. So the longer you leave it at room temperature, the more likely you're going to have microbial growth. And that's the time piece as well. So oxygen is a tricky one. Some microbes prefer oxygen, some microbes prefer no oxygen. So you just have to be aware of that and how that relates to your product, and moisture as well. So microbes need water to grow as well. So the more water in your product, the more likely you're going to have some microbial growth, unless that's controlled in another way. So when we're talking about regulatory food product classification, we're talking about how the FDA classifies your food product. And that's really based on the acidity and water activity of your food product, or the water activity means the available water for microbial growth. And this could be based on the percentage of certain ingredients there, or it also could be, and also it's each one of these classifications, it has implications for storage and processing and packaging, and also the necessary training that you would need to have. So we'll get into this a little more now. So each one of these factors we're going to talk about. So we talked about acid. This is a pH scale. pH scale goes from 0 to 14, but most foods are, I mean, water is right at 7. And most foods are going to be, you know, somewhere between like, probably you can see lemon juice is 2.4. So that's pretty low. That's an acid. And chocolate cake, we are at like 7.6. So we don't really get any too much higher than that. After that, it starts to get more toxic as we get towards the more alkaline level. We're looking at like seawater, hand soap, that's way up there. When we talk about low acid foods, we're actually talking about foods that are above 4.6 on the pH scale, according to the FDA. And so the lower the acid, the more safe they're going to be, as I mentioned before. So if your product is on the low acid side, meaning the pH is higher, you can add acids to that product to make it safer. So you can add like citric acid, like a lemon juice. You could add acetic acid, which is more like a vinegar. But then you could also add malic acid or tartaric acid or fumaric acid. And then there are some natural processes that create a more acidic product too, like fermentation. So if you have a sauerkraut, that's going to be a lactic acid fermentation. And that fermentation process creates more lactic acid, and the lactic acid creates a lower pH and makes it more safe. So that's just a little bit about acidity in food. Okay, and why we talked about 4.6, so why is that the limit? That's because Clostridium botulinum, which I mentioned briefly before, it's a very deadly, it produces a deadly toxin, and you basically need like a half a teaspoon of Clostridium botulinum toxin to kill a lot of people. I mean, it's extremely important, and it becomes one of our main focuses here at the Food Venture Center to look at that limit of 4.6. The other thing about Clostridium botulinum is that it grows without the presence of oxygen. So if you have something like these canned corn here, now we don't know if this is corn that's filled with vinegar or water, for example. If it's with water, this is likely going to be a low acid food. And if it's canned in like a water bath canner, there's not going to be any air in that jar. In which case, that can be a very dangerous environment that could promote the growth of Clostridium botulinum. In order to destroy this, if you have a low acid food, such as this, we'll just assume this is corn with water, you would not want to hot fill it. You would need something like a very, very high temperature and very high pressure to destroy the spores of this bacteria, which is what creates the toxin, because it's very resistant to heat. Something like boiling water bath is not going to do it. And Clostridium botulinum is everywhere. It's in the soil, that produce is grown in. So anything could potentially be contaminated with it. Okay, some other classifications are acid foods. So acid foods are foods that have a naturally low pH, and they're going to be naturally safe. Most fruits are going to be acid foods, so you can see apples, bananas, grapes, raisins. Most of these fruits are going to be acid, but there are some low acid fruits like bananas. They're going to be low acid. They're not going to be as acidic. There are a couple other low acid fruits but generally an acid food is going to have natural acid in it. So you can see, in addition to fruits, like fruit products, applesauces, jams, honey, barbecue sauce, a lot of these products are going to be inherently safe. And they're so safe that oftentimes they can be approved not only they can approve to be made in your own home, like a standard jam, because it's such a safe product. Now, on the other side of it, we have the low acid foods, which I mentioned before. Again, they're foods with pH above 4.6, which makes them a high risk for other pathogens, especially Clostridium botulinum and Listeria. So for small scale processors, it's very difficult to make these types of foods shelf stable, because you need that very high heat and very high pressure. And that would be achieved by a retort process or an aseptic process. And if you're doing this, you're definitely going to fall under the jurisdiction of the FDA and USDA and would need to file specific forms related to these products because they are much higher risk for foodborne illness. And then we have acidified foods. So an acidified food is a low acid food that uses acid to bring the pH down. So these are safe, but they're actually higher risk than a naturally acid food. So an example of an acidified food would be a pickle. So you have a cucumber, which is a low acid food. Most vegetables are low acid, but you add the vinegar to it, which is very high acid, and that acidifies the food. So again, because they are higher risk, they are going to require more regulatory oversight. The FDA requires you to file specific forms for acidified foods, not only for your facility, but for the product itself. And also, this type of food requires special training. You need to go through better process control school, because if something happens and you're processing that the acidification fails, all of a sudden you have a low acid food and it becomes a very high risk product. So again, for acidified foods, almost, especially if they're shelf stable, almost always you're going to need to get a scheduled process for this and have that approved by a process authority like the Food Venture Center. Okay, another product classification is fermented acid foods. And so I talked about this a little before, the lactic acid fermentation of sauerkraut or kimchi. Yogurt is a lactic acid fermentation. With vegetables, essentially what happens here is if you use a minimum of 2.25% salt, this will encourage the lactic acid growth. And the more lactic acid is, the more that lactic acid bacteria can outcompete any bad pathogens that are there. So they're pretty strong, but the salt helps to encourage their growth. So especially for fermented vegetable products, that's what we would be looking for in your scheduled process. And in general, if your fermentation is successful and good, they tend to have a shelf life that is indefinite. It could be, but they would almost always need to be refrigerated unless you incorporate a heat step for canning them. Other types of fermentation are like alcoholic or acetic acid fermentation. So it's a little bit different microorganism that facilitates this process. But things like kombucha and vinegar, kvass, wine, fire ciders, those things are more like an acetic acid fermentation or alcoholic fermentation. Generally, these are inspected by the state. Oftentimes, the state will require a scheduled process for fermented foods. We see a lot of them here at the Food Venture Center for sure. But this product doesn't usually need to be, the process usually does not need to be filed with the FDA as the acidified foods would need to be. Okay, so another factor that affects microbial growth, as I mentioned, was water activity. So basically what water activity is the free water available in a product for microbial growth. As I mentioned, microbes need water to grow. So either the product has a lot of water in it already, but it is different from water content. Like if we look here at this picture of the soy sauce, that seems like it's quite liquid, like if there would be a lot of water in there, but at the same time, it has so much salt in there that the salt actually binds to the water molecules and makes them not available for microbes to use for growth. So if there is a high salt content, you could actually have a low water activity product. Same with sugars. Sugars do the same thing. So you might have some kind of a syrup, not like maple syrup, but like some other kind of syrup that has such high sugar content that even though it may be very liquidy, there would be no water available for microbial growth in that product. So we measure the water activity here at the Food Venture Center when we're reviewing products. And the scale is, we do it here because the equipment is quite expensive. It's not something that you would likely invest in if you are making a water activity controlled product, because it can cost like $6,000 or $7,000 for this water activity meter. Whereas you can send us a lab sample, we'll do the lab test for $25. And for water activity controlled products, it usually needs to be done 2 to 4 times per year, depending on your production. But the scale goes from 0 to 1. So 1 being water itself and 0 being like sand or something that has no water at all. And usually, well, we'll talk about this. So you can see here, different microorganisms can grow at different water activity levels. So, you know, the pathogens, which are like the Staph aureus, the Clostridium botulinum, Salmonella, Staph is the lowest one, it's 0.85. So it can grow at a water activity level of 0.85. So when we're talking about shelf-stable products, generally it needs to be, the water activity needs to be below 0.85 to ensure there's no pathogen growth in there for a shelf-stable product. But you can see that the spoilage organisms like molds can grow at a little bit lower. So in this case, you would need to really incorporate a heat step into your product to ensure that no spoilage of microorganisms would grow unless the water activity was lower, like 0.6 and below, pretty much nothing can grow. So that would be something like granola often, or crackers, or there are some other like peanut butters and things like that can also have a very low water activity level, maybe below 0.6. And this is what I was just talking about. So some other examples could be salted fish, popcorn, honey also has a very low activity level because of all that sugar. Okay, so then the next one in our Fat Tom, we're talking about temperature. So different microbes can grow at different temperatures. Some prefer cooler temperatures, some prefer hot temperatures, but most grow at that middle temperature between 86 and 98 degrees Fahrenheit. So there are different ways to control them. Cooking can kill pathogens and other microorganisms. Refrigeration will slow down their growth. Freezing stops growth, but if you thaw that product, they'll start to grow again if they're there. So if you have a frozen product, it's important to put directions on your frozen product as to how to handle that and after it's frozen. And again, holding at ambient temperatures is going to encourage faster microbial growth. Commercial sterilization temperatures are usually between 180 and 280 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is going to depend on a lot of other attributes of the product. So the lower the pH, for example, the lower the commercial sterilization temperature needs to be. And commercial sterilization basically means that you're heating that product to a temperature where you're killing all microbes in there and it's going to be safe. You can have a shelf-stable product if it's cooked and filled at that temperature. You know, whereas that's a little bit different from pasteurization. So pasteurization, you're killing the microorganisms, but you're not preventing the growth of anything. So that's not going to, pasteurization usually does not result in a shelf-stable product. It might result in a safe refrigerated product for a little bit longer shelf life. But again, so the lower pH is going to, or lower at water activity, the commercial sterilization temperature will be lower. If you have a low acid food, on the other hand, you're going to have to heat it to a much higher temperature to reach that commercial sterilization. So think about like canned vegetables, for example. That's why they're in those, you know, the metal cans, is because they need to go through a retort system and get that really high temperature and really high pressure. The other system that does that is aseptic. If you think of something like different nut-based milks, they're in those kind of those rectangular cardboard aseptic Tetra Pak type packages. That also uses very high temperature. Even though they're a low acid product, that can commercially sterilize the product and potentially make it shelf stable, where it doesn't need refrigeration for safety after you open it. So best temperatures for holding food are above 140 or below 41 degrees. Like for refrigeration, temperatures are typically below 41 degrees Fahrenheit. And this just explains a little bit more about those temperatures and why. So again, like if you look at the bottom, you'll see the pH scale on the left side with the mild heat is 3 to 4.6. You might need a mild heat to get rid of not only it'll get rid of the bacterial vegetative cells, as well as the spores, which are like the seeds of the bacteria. If the product is acid, it's more difficult for those spores to survive. If it has less acid, low acid, the spores need much higher heat to be destroyed. Okay, some techniques for facilitating, a shelf-stable product is especially in I guess economical and small scale production would be to lower the pH of a product. So we can see here I have a picture of this red hot pepper jelly. So typically peppers are not an acidic food, but you can see here on the ingredients that the producer added vinegar, lemon juice, and pineapples to there, which made them more acidic and brought the pH way down. And also that makes the processing temperature lower and allows this product to be shelf stable. The other thing you can do is reduce the water activity of a certain product by adding sugar or salt or add preservatives. So I should say that one thing people sometimes get confused about is whether their product needs to have low pH and low water activity. Generally, that's not the case. Generally, either the pH is controlling microbial growth or the water activity is controlling microbial growth, not usually both. Every once in a while, you might have a product that it's kind of on the fence, and if they have a little bit lower side of both the water activity and the pH, that can help to make the product shelf stable with more milder processing conditions. But generally it's one or the other. Okay, other food preservation techniques would be using refrigeration. So if say you have a delicious low acid food that, it's some kind of a soup or, in this case, chili, that it's really good, and like acidifying this product is really going to change the whole flavor of it, and that's not really what you want to do. You can sell your product as refrigerated or as frozen. The drawback to that, of course, is that you have a much shorter shelf life, which is hard as a small processor. It doesn't give you a lot of time to get your product to your outlet, and it doesn't give the outlet a lot of time to sell the product. So, but certainly that is an option to sell your product as refrigerated. And also there's not as much refrigeration space in stores and things like that too. Freezing is another option if you have a low acid product, or just like a higher risk product. A lot of prepared foods, you can do a flash freeze, and it extends the shelf life to months or even years. For safety reasons, it could be good basically indefinitely. The quality is what tends to suffer over time and be the determining factor for the shelf life. It can have a high energy cost and difficult to get retail space, but it may be the best way to sell your product as you're starting out if that applies to your product. And then oxygen, again, this is the difference between an aerobic, a microorganism that's considered aerobic requires oxygen to grow, and that could be things like yeast and molds. Anaerobic microbes cannot grow in oxygen when oxygen is present, and they thrive in more vacuum packaged foods. And Clostridium botulinum is one of those. And then you have the facultative anaerobes, which can grow with or without oxygen. So Salmonella, Listeria, E. coli can grow in either condition. So it's important to be aware of that. So another type of packaging option that you can use is called reduced oxygen packaging. And what that is any kind of packaging procedure that results in an environment inside that's reduced from the composition of air that we breathe. So normally there's about 21% oxygen. So typically reduced oxygen levels can be anywhere from 0 to 15%. So vacuum packaging, for example, is a reduced oxygen packaging. Excuse me. It is important to note that vacuum packaging does not always extend the shelf life of your product. It can extend the shelf life of certain products, but it's actually not always safe for all products, particularly if they are low acid products. So vacuum packaging is great because, again, it inhibits the spoilage microorganisms that need the air to grow, but it does create an environment that is anaerobic. So if your product is low acid and refrigerated, Clostridium botulinum could potentially grow in there. If you have a low acid product that you want to vacuum pack, it is more recommended to freeze it first and then vacuum package it. There are some products like raw meats that can be vacuum packed at refrigerated temperatures. And that is because even though they are low acid, they also have a lot of beneficial microorganisms that are existing there, and they outcompete any type of pathogenic microorganisms. But if you're interested in vacuum packaging your product, don't just assume that you can do that. Your inspector will ask you to get what's called a hazard analysis. And again, we can do that here at the Food Venture Center, which investigates if it is hazardous to vacuum pack your products. It looks at all the potential hazards. What are the biological hazards associated with this product? And is that, is it too high of a risk or is it not? Is it fine? So you'll need that to be able to use any vacuum packaging machine in New York State. So there's some of the other benefits of ROP, reduced oxygen packaging, is that it can minimize some undesirable chemical reactions like oxidation of fats and vitamins and discoloration and things like that. So again, the biological hazards are those anaerobic microbes like Listeria and Clostridium botulinum, because they can also grow at refrigerated temperatures in the case of Listeria, and also some Clostridium botulinum as well. Okay, so hazard control in ROP would be, again, like foods that don't support the growth of these pathogens, like high acid foods or meats, like I mentioned. You can also use some chemicals to inhibit growth. So in the case of cured meats, sodium nitrate and also nitrates can help inhibit the growth of some of these pathogens, as well as like a salt brine concentration of 3.5% or more. There's also some other chemicals like niacin. Celery extract is also a natural source of nitrate that can help prevent the growth of pathogens. And then again, if there's like high level of non-pathogenic competing microorganisms like lactic acid, or the ones I talked about with raw meats, or if there's like a product with live cultures like cheeses, that's going to outcompete the pathogenic microbes and make it more safe and amenable to reduce oxygen packaging. You do need to use a proper cooling and refrigeration, and also like use by dates and handling instructions for how to handle that product when you take it, especially if it's frozen and a low acid product. You would want to have instructions about opening the product before thawing it and cooking immediately. And the reason why you would need this hazard analysis from the Food Venture Center is because the state is going to ask you to get what's called a variance to be able to produce a reduced oxygen packaging product, to be able to use that vacuum packer. And that's in the food code, it's the FDA's food code. So keep in mind that you'll get the hazard analysis from us, and then you go to Ag and Markets and you get the variance. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about critical factors right now. Critical factors are critical factors for safety. So what that is, it's a specific process range or limit that the manufacturer must comply with to ensure food safety of that product. And it's important that manufacturers keep records of these critical factors during production. So the critical factors are determined generally by a process authority. And they're going to be based on food classification risk or the characteristics of that certain product. They usually include processing parameters, packaging and distribution parameters, and shelf life. So some critical factors can be like the cook step. They can be a cooling regime, certain ingredient sources. They can be the pH of a product, whether you're using preservatives, fermentation conditions, or water activity. So I bring this up because the critical factors are going to be listed on your scheduled process. This is one of the big things why inspectors ask for the scheduled process. So they have written critical factors that validate the safety of the product, meaning that if you follow the critical factors in the scheduled process, your product is going to be safe. The scheduled process also includes the formulation, as well as processing steps, general storage, distribution, and selling conditions. And again, like in New York State, if you're doing a shelf-stable product, a scheduled process is going to be required for your product to be sold and approved to be sold. And some products, the FDA requires you to file the scheduled process with them. And that would be for shelf-stable, low acid, acidified foods, and some water activity controlled foods that are above that 0.85 level. Okay, this is an example of what a scheduled process looks like. One of the ones that we would present for you. This is a made up one, so we're not sharing anyone's, confidential information. But you can see at the top, it says the name of the product. It says the classification there, which is acidified food. And it says shelf stable. So this one is approved to be sold without refrigeration. And as a shelf-stable food, what that basically means is that there is no expiration date on your product for safety. You can open it like 50 years from now and it's still safe. It may not be the quality you want to sell, but it will be safe. No one is going to get sick from it. And the shelf-stable food manufacturers don't need to put in an expiration date or a use by date, but you may want to put a best by date, which is just based on the quality. You may notice after like 6 months, a year, 2 years, that maybe the flavor changes, or maybe the texture changes, or the color, something about it that you're not comfortable selling, you would put a best by date. Again, it's not for safety. No one's going to get sick. It is still a shelf-stable product. That would just be a quality date. And then you can see outlined in the yellow box, the critical factors there. That's what that looks like. So in this pickle product, the critical factor is a maximum pH of 3.9. For pickles, we usually require maximum solids because, again, this is garlic. It's low acid, but we're using vinegar. The processor is using vinegar to acidify it. So there has to be enough vinegar in there to be sure that all of those solids get acidified to that low pH level. And then there's a processing temperature and a processing time, and also a process. They're using a boiling water bath to process these. And then we test the pH of the product too. You can see here the scheduled process has the weight of all the ingredients. So if you would be submitting a product to us, you would give us the formulation in weight, but then the weight gets converted into a percentage. So if you decide to then go to a co-packer and scale up from, one, like maybe 10 jars to like 1,000 jars, the co-packer could use those percentages to do that. And then we have the procedure on there. This is the first page of the schedule process. Usually the second page has additional notes and things like that on there. I didn't show here, but just to give you an idea. These would be important monitoring instruments for your critical factors, like a pH meter. If you have a pH controlled food, you would definitely want to invest in a pH meter. For sure. They're not that expensive. You can get a decent handheld digital one for a couple $100, $200 to $300. The water activity meter is going to be more expensive. Again, you might want to do that with us rather than, get one for yourself. Thermometers, refractometers measure the bricks of certain products like jams and jellies, and a vacuum gauge. So now we're going to get more deeply into the regulation part. Basically, regulations are not one size fits all, but all facilities are, regulations do apply to all facilities. It's just your facility is exempt from responsibility to produce safe food. And that's what the regulations are really about, is ensuring safe food to the public. But depending on your scale of production and the type of food that you use, that's going to really determine what type of regulations apply to you. So this kind of lays it out, because a lot of times I find that people are completely confused about who they go to for what, which agency regulates what part of food production. So local health department is very important in food service, and also for a commercial kitchen license. So if you're building out a commercial kitchen, you go to your local health department for the inspection and to get your license. They're also the lead agency investigating foodborne illness outbreaks, but they work with other agencies too. At the state level in New York, it's the Ag and Markets, or NYSDAM, as we call it. And they are responsible for retail food stores, wholesale food manufacturers, other than USDA products. And they do share jurisdiction at wholesale with the FDA, meaning that you probably won't have an FDA inspector come to your facility. So NYSDAM enforces FDA regulation on behalf of FDA. And also NYSDAM also has jurisdiction over meat processors that are not covered under USDA. So the USDA basically is responsible for meat, poultry, egg products. And when we talk about meat products, meat containing products, that means that they have more than 2% cooked meat or 3% raw meat. So anything that's not covered under USDA, so again, meat and poultry is basically what they do. Meat meaning beef generally, and pork as well. But there are some other meat producers that are maybe like rabbits or pheasant, some game meats and things like that, that would more be under the state level rather than the USDA level. And then the FDA pretty much covers everything else besides meats. They do seafood, except for USDA does siluriforms, which are like catfish, but everything else FDA does. They do dairy, shell eggs, juice, all kinds of products. They pretty much do everything else. Okay, so we're gonna start kind of at the smallest level and build up to the federal level. So, so in New York State, for processors, there is the first thing that if you start processing foods, you're going to fall under some regulation. Low risk products such as baked goods, standard jams, and repackaging of different products, and also some double crusted fruit pies and some snack items, they can be qualified for the home processors exemption, which means that you can make this in your own home. You do need to let NYSDAM know that you're making it in your own home. You cannot use any commercial size equipment to make it, but it has to be sold within New York State. They cannot be sold over state lines. And you do need to have water analysis if you're on a well water, if you're on a private water supply. But basically, if you have a low risk food, you can fall under this home processors exemption. There is no licensing fee or anything like that. You just have to let NYSDAM know that that's what you're doing. You do still have to label your product under FDA requirements. Again, it has the product name, the ingredients listed by weight, the net quantity of content. So that's going to be 10 ounces, or 1 pound, whatever you want to put there. It has to have the weight. And then your processor's name, address, and any allergen identification, which we'll talk about what that is. So if you don't fall under the home processors exemption, you're going to fall under state regulation. And I listed pretty much everything here. But and if you're under state regulation and you are processing a food, you're going to need what's called a 20C license. So just to be clear, food processing is anything beyond that first harvest cut. So if you're cutting a head of lettuce, that's not, you're cutting it from the root. Okay, you're selling lettuce as whole, head of lettuce. That's not food processing. But if you chop it up and sell it as chopped lettuce, that's processing. Or if you mix it with other baby greens together, that is food processing. As well as all of these other particular things that I've listed here and many more. So that's something important to remember. If you're doing anything beyond that first harvest cut, you are a food processor and you need to apply for a 20C license. The way that you do that is you can go onto their website and the licensing application is right there. It's very simple. It's like a couple pages. It doesn't apply to food service establishments. If it's your first time applying and you're in an incubator kitchen, it's free for the first 2 years. If you're a small scale processor, it's $175, and everyone else, it's $400. It's valid for 2 years. You do need a workers' comp insurance. And as soon as you apply for your license, you're going to alert NYSDAM to the fact that you're a food processor, and they will come out to do the initial inspection of what you're doing. And it may be like within 6 months of your application. So at that point, they're going to check and see what you're doing and make sure what you're doing is safe. And that's when they may say, oh, I see you're making a shelf-stable product. You need to have a scheduled process, call Cornell. So that's usually what happens. Other things about 20C license is that you do need to follow good manufacturing practices. This is part of the Food Safety Modernization Act, a regulation, which we'll talk about a little later. Most people are exempt from this food safety course certification unless you make more than $3 million annual gross income. And you do need to keep records of your manufacturing operations, including the products that you process, code numbers, size of the containers, numbers of containers per coating, and any other processing data. So it's for traceability. In case something happens, you have to be able to identify that. And the inspectors will be looking for your documentation for sure. And then product label. Okay, there are some exemptions from 20C license. We talked about the home processors exemption, some other products like honey, maple syrup, hops, malt, and any kind of like facilities licensed by the state liquor authority are also exempt, including slicing cheese at farmers markets. Okay, so next level, we're getting to the federal level now. So we'll talk about the USDA. So again, this applies to manufacturers who are selling meat and poultry products wholesale. If you're selling retail, you do not fall under the USDA, you would fall under NYSDAM. So again, products with 3% raw meat or 2% cooked meat. Also, if you're slaughtering animals, you'll need to have a USDA inspector on site during your operation. USDA, it's a FSIS, Food Safety and Inspection Service, was created during the Federal Meat Inspection Act, which happened, I believe, is like early 20th century. It's ensures the humane handling of animals and safe sanitary handling of meat, proper labeling and packaging. If you do make if you're producing a meat product, you are required to have a HACCP plan, which is hazard analysis and critical control plan. And this can be, overwhelming for a lot of people because basically you're identifying any hazards or potential hazards in your operation from not only just as you're making the product, but from beginning to end and all throughout the facility, including sanitation and receiving your ingredients and employee actions in your facility. but it's extremely important. You're identifying the hazards. You're also identifying how to control these hazards and what you would do if, where you would control that, where's that critical control point, and what you would do to resolve any kind of situation. So Cornell does offer an online self-directed HACCP course for people who are not familiar with that. But it is something that's important for you to do for your own facility, because you're going to know your facility better than anyone. If you have a USDA product also, you need to get a grant of inspection. There's no cost to that. There is a form on their website that you would do to fill out to get that grant of inspection. And so some exemptions from USDA, as I mentioned, if you are retailing your product rather than wholesaling your product, you are exempt. Restaurants, kitchens, any kind of operations that are done in retail stores, like cutting, slicing, a butcher or deli, something like that, is going to be exempt from the USDA inspection, but you do need to use USDA inspected meat. There are some custom exempt facilities. So oftentimes if someone is raising meat for like a meat CSA, livestock for meat CSA, that can get around the USDA inspection requirement, because you're actually raising it for someone else's personal use. So also, it's more of like a custom facility. So it's an interesting loophole that people sometimes can use in that situation. Also, if you're just personally using your livestock, you're not selling it to the public, you're exempt from inspection, or game meat as well. As I mentioned, that would fall under NYSDAM. Some states do have their own inspection programs, but New York is not one of them. Okay, so next we're getting into the FDA regulated products. So again, FDA regulates pretty much everything else, like most foods, and in addition to dietary supplements, cosmetics, medicines, biological products, medical devices, tobacco, electronic products. And the FDA has a lot of different forms that you would need to file depending on your product. So if you are processing food, the first thing you need to do is register your facility with the FDA. And the form is 3537. All of these forms are available electronically on their website, as well as hard copies you can mail them into. And some products will require what's called process filing, which is what you need the scheduled process for. So low acid canned foods, acidified canned foods, and low water activity foods that are not super low, like they're above 0.85, but they're below 0.91. Those are going to require process filing with the FDA. And then the FDA also does require a HACCP plan for certain products. So like whole eggs, seafood, dairy, and juice all require a HACCP plan. And again, those are the juice is if you are wholesaling your juice, not if you're just selling your juice directly to customers at a farmer's market. The HACCP plan does not apply to your operation. Okay, some other regulations that apply to the FDA. This one they have is they have standards of identity for different kinds of products. And this is just something to be aware of. We see quite often. They have a written description of a product that allows it to be called a certain name. One of them that's very common is jams and jellies. So one of the requirements is that the bricks must be above 65 degrees Brix. And that's a measure of soluble solids, often related to the sugars. So if it's a traditional jam, like a blueberry jam or strawberry jam, and there's 45 parts fruit and 55 parts sugar, generally the Brix is going to be within that range. But now we see all kinds of jams and jellies, like hot pepper jam, for example. Often those or maybe people want to make a low sugar jam, something like that. Often the bricks won't measure that. And so, we're obligated to tell people that this doesn't meet the standard of identity of a jam, and that, strictly speaking, it should be called something else, like a spread or a schmear or whatever you want to call it. But it's not a jam or jelly according to the FDA. And there's standards of identity for all kinds of things, like mayonnaise has one, and there's just different kinds of products. Some have it, some don't, and it is related to the safety of the product originally. But it seems like some of them need to be revisited a little bit. Okay, the FDA also has labeling requirements for your foods. So all of the labels must include the name of the product. Again, the net weight should be in standard and metric. So in like ounces and in grams, or pounds and kilograms. The ingredient declaration, which would be in order by descending weight. So the most abundant ingredient first, all the way down to the least, and using a kind of recognizable name, not a scientific name. It needs to have the processor's name and address and have an allergen declaration. So this is a little bit more about the labeling. So the FDA Nutrition and Labeling Act requires products to have nutrition facts on them, but there are exemptions to having that. And it is usually in relation to the size of your business. So if you're a small business with less than 10 employees and you're selling less than 10,000 units of food per year, you don't need nutrition facts on your label, and you don't need to notify the FDA about that. If you're small but a little bit bigger than that, like less than 100 employees, less than 100,000 units, you don't necessarily have to have nutrition facts, but you do need to notify the FDA. And, even if you're not required to have it, we find that a lot of people still like to put it on as just a marketing tool. Maybe their product is healthy and they want to let people know how many vitamins and minerals are in it, or that it's low in sugar or whatever, because there's so many different kinds of dietary preferences right now. A lot of people just go to look for the nutrition facts for that. But again, if you're very small and you fall into this category, you don't have to have it by regulation. Okay, I've talked about allergen labeling a couple times, and this is where I'm going to explain exactly what that means. So the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act described exactly what that means. So there are 9 food allergens that the FDA recognized as major food allergens, and it's milk, eggs, peanuts, tree nuts, fish, shellfish, wheat, soy, and sesame is new this year, actually. With some of these, like the tree nuts, the fish, and the shellfish, you actually have to have on there exactly what that means. So you can't just say tree nuts, you actually need to have almonds on there, or cashews, or whatever it is. Because of people's allergens are so different. Someone, may be allergic to shrimp, but not oysters, something like that. So there's 2 different ways that you can put that on your label. One is contains, and then the ingredient, which is, you can see on the left-hand side of the screen. That's how it's done. It's listed right under the ingredients. It says contains almonds, milk, and soy. The other way that's less common, but is allowable, is just to put the allergen food source in parentheses, just in the ingredient list following the common name of the food. So you might have flour, and then you'll say wheat in parentheses following that. So in your facility, if you are producing products that contain allergens and some that don't, it's really important to prevent allergen cross contact, especially. And that can be controlled in a couple of different ways, either by scheduling and run sequencing. So you run the products that don't have allergens first, and then you do the allergens, and then you do your serious cleaning and sanitation afterwards, and then you start fresh the next day. but also, you know, very good sanitation controls are really, really important. Labeling of your ingredients and your finished product is also really important, that it contains the allergens. And even in your storage, like often recommended to store your ingredients that contain allergens in one place and then non-allergens like in another place, just in case there's some cross-contamination or some failure in their packaging or something like that. And then also post-process allergen cross-contact is really, really important. And training your employees about the importance of this allergen control is really, really important. This is a huge piece of good manufacturing practices that the FDA wrote into their regulation as well, which is what we're going to talk about now. So the Food Safety Modernization Act was passed into law in 2018. So it wasn't, you know, now it's been like 5 years, but so it's, you know, it's really starting to amp up, especially in terms of inspectors and what they're looking for. But the whole idea of the Food Safety Modernization Act was to kind of reduce the amount of foodborne illness and food safety outbreaks that we've been seeing in this country, from instead of just responding to something to preventing it. So the idea is to identify the potential hazards, and this is done through things like the HACCP plan or the schedule process. You're identifying these hazards before you're understanding where those hazards are coming from. You're implementing preventive controls, you're monitoring those, and then you're reviewing and adjusting, and then identifying again. So that's the kind of idea of it. And it's been working. You know, the preventive, the FSMA is actually, that's how we refer to it, FSMA, Food Safety Modernization Act. The regulation number is 21 CFR 117. It's written into the Code of Federal Regulations, was approved by Congress. And the one that it contains a lot of different rules. The one that's most, prevalent to food processors as the preventive controls for human foods rule. If you're a vegetable grower, you're probably very familiar with the produce safety rule as well. But there's also one's preventive control for animal foods rule. That is not about livestock. That's about making food for animals. So like feed or pet food or something like that. So what we're going to talk most about is under the preventive controls for human foods rule. You can see there's 6 different subparts here, but we're going to talk about subpart B. It's current good manufacturing practices. We're going to talk about subpart D, which is modified requirements. And we're going to talk about subpart F, which is about your records that you need to maintain. So just to kind of mention subpart C, which we're not going to talk about here, is that is really the development of a very formal food safety plan. So that is extremely important, but some businesses, some food processing businesses are not required to do that. And that's what the modified requirements are. So a formal food safety plan can be like a very thick document, and it's really identifying everything, and certainly very important for large businesses. But the FDA has made modified requirements for facilities that have less risks based on their size, basically. So who is exempt from parts C and G? That's the again, like the C is the food safety plan and G is the supply chain program. So again, very, very important, but it doesn't really apply to everybody. So these are the types of businesses that are exempt from those parts: alcohol producers, food service, nonprofits, farms, fishery products, juice, low acid canned foods. Now the juice and the fish and the low acid canned foods, they're exempt because they should have a HACCP plan. So they already are identifying all these possible hazards and risks. But also, other low risk foods would be exempt. So if you're like holding and repacking of low-risk food, that would be like a warehouse, like a warehousing facility. And then qualified facilities, which are very small businesses. And that's what we're going to talk about right now. Very quickly, like a farm definition in this case are folks that are, as far as processing, they may only be drying or dehydrating raw agricultural products or commodities. So it could be raisins, it could be grains also, or they're not doing any additional processing, or maybe they're using like ripening apples with ethylene. That would also make them exempt from this requirement. But a qualified facility is a very small business, essentially. So if you're making less than $1 million in sales over a 3-year period, or less than $500,000 in gross annual sales over a 3-year period, and selling to someone who is within the same state of yourself. So that's a qualified facility. So this is very important to know, because it really changes what you need to do and show to your inspector. And this year in particular, after speaking with NYSDAM, they are starting to amp up their inspections related to this, related to the preventive controls rule. So you're the one who's responsible for determining and for letting the FDA know that you are a qualified facility. So you have to do your income calculation and then submit it to the FDA every year for 3 years. And they do say that it should be adjusted each year for inflation, which is interesting, because that will really apply now that we're dealing with inflation rates the way they are. So you may, I don't have I just recommend talking to an accountant to help you do that. There are some formulations that can help you do that, but I'm not going to go over that right now. The main thing that you need to do to let the FDA know that you're a qualified facility is submit what's called an attestation form. So this is a statement that lets them know that, number one, you're within the income bracket that qualifies you as a qualified facility. And then you also have to have documentation showing that even though you don't have a formal food safety plan, that you have identified the hazards and are implementing preventive controls in your facility and monitoring them to ensure that they are effective, or that, you know, your facility is complying with like non-federal food safety laws. So the scheduled process, for one, is one way to comply with this requirement, at least for a big part of this requirement. So this is something, and basically the form, again, pretty simple, but you just have to let the FDA know that you are taking care of this, even though you don't have a food safety plan. And your inspector will be looking for this type of documentation. So not only that you're identifying, but you're also monitoring your production to show that you're within, you know, you're monitoring the critical factors for safety for this product. Okay. So subpart B of FSMA is good manufacturing practices, current good manufacturing practices. And this just isn't like a phrase. This is actually what the regulation is called. So it does apply to all foods regulated by the FDA. Basically, it's basic sanitation controls for all foods and processing plants. And it's a prerequisite program. So it's not going to be necessarily listed in a scheduled process that you know, you should be monitoring all employees for washing their hands and making sure that they're not wearing jewelry when they're handling food. This is something that you should be implementing into your operations, standard operating procedures and sanitation standard operating procedures, so that anyone who works in your plant is aware of how to keep the product safe, just with cleaning, sanitation, and hygienic practices. So in general, and this is the general headings, but there's more details if you were to go online and look for this. But general GMPs apply to personnel. So, you know, what they're wearing, how often they're washing, how often personnel are washing their hands. You know, it's, smoking in the facility, those kinds of things. It's going to entail plants and grounds. So the maintenance and sanitation of the plant itself, like what are the sanitation operations in the outside the plant. You have a lot of vegetation growing where there could be pests that may harbor pests and create little homes for rodents or whatever. What about the sanitation operations within your facility? So that's like not only throughout production, but also like the floors, the walls, the bathrooms, and what kind of procedures do you have in place to keep all of those clean? Same with the equipment and utensils that you're using for your food production, your processes and controls for preventive controls, for kind of general things like even just receiving ingredients or storing your packaging, all of those kinds of things need to be our components of GMPs. Warehousing and distribution. So, what does your warehouse facility look like? What about the distribution? What are those vehicles looking like? Are they being kept clean? Are they, being controlled for any kind of food safety risk? And also, if you have a product where it has a byproduct that you will then be processing into an animal food, they're very strict about how that product is held. It has to be held in also a very sanitary way to make sure that there is no risk of microbial growth. It can't just be thrown in a garbage bag or something like that. It has to be sure that it's in like a hard container, that no pests are going to enter. And also defect action levels. So that means if something goes wrong, what's the point where what point are you doing something to address that issue? Another part of the regulation is that all employees who are handling food and are working in the facility must receive hygienic and food safety training. So that is like a good manufacturing practices training. And then the employer must keep records of that training on file for inspectors to see. So we do have the Institute for Food Safety at Cornell has an online kind of self-directed GMPs training, which is a good way to get that training in and can be done, kind of at your own pace as well. And then subpart F of the regulation is about record requirements. So again, like we always say, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. Inspectors aren't going to want to hear, well, I did that, I just don't have the record that documents it. There's no way for them to know that that's what actually happened. So you really need to keep records of hazard analysis, employee training, any SOPs, monitoring, financial records. They should be accurate and legible. They should be taken at the time that whatever operation is done. So if you're in the middle of production and you're measuring the pH of your product, that's when that should be written down, not before, like, oh, I think it will be 4.2, or, oh yeah, I remember that yesterday it was 4.2. You really need to take it at that time. You need to hold those records at your facility for at least 2 years. And up to 3 years if you're a qualified facility, because the qualified facility status is a 3-year increment. But if the records are more than 6 months old, they can be stored off-site. They just need to be able to be retrieved within 24 hours. Other things about the records is they should be original true copies or controlled electronics. So you can keep electronic records, but they need to be password protected to be sure that no one can just change them and go in and change those values, that they're protected. And be as detailed as possible. And they should include the name and location of the facility, the date and the time of the activity, the identity of the product or the lot code, so you can trace that back. Whatever production record is traced back to the actual product. And very important to have the signature of the person who is taking that record. And just a couple other things for hazard analysis and preventive controls. Really important records to keep are critical factors, your scheduled process, employee training, sanitizer concentration, any kind of visual inspections for cleanliness, allergens, declaration, and any kind of other documentation of allergens in a multi-use facility. Traceability records, all facilities should have a recall plan on record and practice that recall plan, equipment calibration, financial records. So anything, the more the better, really, basically. Take notes of everything. Okay. All right, so we've hit the end. Are you completely overwhelmed, or did that help?
Probably both. I would imagine both.
Oh, this is just the last slide here. This is about our eCornell certificate, which Rhiannon mentioned in the beginning. It's, if you're interested in product development, we released this certificate course last year. It goes from basically the beginning of product ideation all the way up to commercialization, and you get to use your own product idea for the projects and get feedback from the facilitators. So it's great if you have a product idea but it's not fully developed. This can help you with that.
Well, thank you so much, Cynthia. For everybody listening, James just put the evaluation link in the chat. If you could please take 60 seconds to fill it out, or maybe even less than that. We are grant funded and rely on evaluations in order to report back to our funders and keep the programming free for all of you. So we really, really appreciate when you take the time to do that. We do have a couple of minutes, literally. Maybe Cynthia, if you can stay on for a couple extra minutes if anybody does have questions. Happy to answer them now. You can either put questions in the chat or just unmute. And or you can send me any questions via email, and I'm happy to send them along and get back to you that way if you have other questions.
I think you're muted, owner, if you're trying to ask a question.
Let's see.
Or maybe he wasn't talking to us. I had a question, Cynthia. Back to the 20C regulations you were talking about, sort of that first, beyond that first field cut. You had mentioned like the blending of baby greens, and I was just wondering if you could clarify that. I know, you know, I've blended a lot of baby greens in the past without having a 20C license. You know, you do the sort of like harvest of baby greens, you know, put them into a big wash tank, blend them up, dry them, bag them. Is that something that you think would personally fall into 20C requirements or no?
I mean, I've been told that the mixing of greens falls into processing categories like that, the 20C license. Even though, like, to me, that's like one harvest cut, but then you're mixing it all together. So, you know, that's what I've been told. But maybe, you know, if you're not sure, you can also reach out to NYSDAM and ask them for sure. It's a lot of times, sometimes things like that come down to your particular inspector as well. That's what we found.
It does make sense though for the logic pattern to be like, oh, is this ready to eat? You know, I think that's kind of the piece there, is if you're providing food to somebody who might not think to wash it again, that's when things get dangerous.
Exactly.
Did washing fall into that post first cut procedures, or is washing not included in processing? Okay. Washing
is usually included in the produce safety rule. I think there's certain pieces of that needs to be washed. But, you know, if you're doing a processed food, then that's going to be part of your preventive controls too. You know, that's going to be part of your, like, that's any scheduled process. The first thing you're going to say is like, wash and prepare ingredients, right? But if you're just doing that harvest cut and then washing and selling the product, then that wouldn't be, you know, a processing license necessarily. No.
Yeah. I can imagine one way to get, you know, to not have to worry about the blending rules, to just do some like intercropping, and then just, you know, the first cut is already blending the ingredients.
Yeah.
So technically speaking.
Yeah,
There's
right.
a question in the chat here from Stephanie. She says, as a home processor in New York State, I run a very small business. How many of these regulatory agencies might I be exempt from reporting to beyond NYSDAM?
So it just depends on the product, really. So if you're a home processor and you're making things like jams and cookies and double crusted pies, then you don't fall under any of the federal regulatory requirements. But if now you start making pickles or salsas, then you'll fall under NYSDAM, and the pickles will fall under FDA. So, and you wouldn't be able to use your home kitchen for that. So it's important to know that difference, especially be familiar with that list of approved products for home processing, because you know, a lot of people start off as small business and then they realize they want to make some other products. So once you start to explore, it's important to know where they fall in regulatory compliance. Hope that answered it.
I have a question. So sometimes on my farm or on other farms in the area, people will, you know, bring things back from market and they'll be like, oh, I would love to, you know, still make use of this and turn this into a product. But what's on hand isn't always consistent from week to week. Are there successful ways that you've seen farmers comply, but also be flexible with their ingredients?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, definitely. So again, it like depends on what product you're talking about, right? So if, you know, some products in New York State won't even require what the scheduled process. And if they don't require it, then you can be pretty flexible with it. I mean, you'll have to make sure that your labeling is reflective, you know, have some kind of label that does include all the ingredients on there. So, and it can be something you make yourself or whatever, but it does have to reflect that. So if you made, say, just say like a refrigerated salsa, and that wouldn't need a scheduled process because it's refrigerated. You could put different kinds of tomatoes, different kinds of peppers, whatever in there, and then just keep your ingredient list the same. Even if it was different kinds of peppers and you listed peppers on the ingredient list, that's fine, right? If, however, you have some kind of product that, like different kinds of pickles, say 1 week you have carrots and then another week you've got cucumbers, each one of those is going to need their own scheduled process. And when you can't change that up, the scheduled process are really very specific to the product. If you decide to change the ingredients, you need to change the document or make another version of the document or something like that. So that's where you fall into that issue of you know, being a little more tricky when you're kind of going on the fly. But refrigerated products, you have a lot more flexibility with, or frozen.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Cynthia, we've got a couple more questions in the chat, and I have a question about honey, if you have just a couple more minutes. Somebody's asking, Connie's asking about where can we find information about working with chocolate? Connie, I'm not sure if you're talking about like baked goods with chocolate in it or just straight chocolate. I think it kind of depends on what kind of foods you're talking about, but maybe we're assuming just straight chocolate.
Yeah, that's right, James.
Dipping chocolate.
Dipping chocolate. Like a dipping chocolate, like a container that would be like refrigerated or shelf stable,
Or like maybe a chocolate covered strawberry or something like that.
Like chocolate dipped cookies, it sounds like maybe.
Yeah,
okay.
I would like one.
So like that kind of thing is like chocolate dip cookies are pretty low risk and probably would even fall under the home processor's exemption. If you, and chocolate in general is pretty low risk because it's a processed product. Where you get into trouble, I think, is if you're making like a fudge sauce or something like that and you wanted it to be shelf stable, then again, you would need the scheduled process to do something like that because you're going to be adding other ingredients in there, different kinds of, probably different butters and maybe dairy, or I don't know what you would add, but you would add something different to it that would change the nature of just the chocolate itself. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah. Connie replied, said that New York State, I think Ag and Markets shows candies, I think, under the home processor's license, but not chocolate, I guess. But I think it would fall under that candies. Then we have a question about storing product. So when storing product, is there a particular method that needs to be used? Is there an agency that regulates how product is stored?
Again, it's going to depend on the product itself. So, so if it's a shelf stable product, like your facility needs to make sure that it's stored so it's not going to be, at risk for any kind of like pest, any kind of pests getting into it, or biological risks of like moisture dripping on it, or, so it's kind of, I guess, I want to say use your common sense a little bit, but you want to keep it like safe and clean and dry when it comes to shelf stable things. When it comes to refrigerated items, then it's very specific as to the temperatures that it must be stored at, which is 41 degrees or below. And then same with frozen products, like it needs to be stored usually at 0 degrees Fahrenheit or below to ensure that it remains frozen. So, yeah, it depends on the type of product as far as storage conditions. Shelf stable wise, the temperature isn't as much of an issue, but the environment is. So.
That's great. So my honey related question, this came up recently with a couple of different clients who are looking into honey products like honey sticks, like flavored honey sticks and flavored honeys. I'm having a really hard time finding information about whether or not that requires a scheduled process, because once you've incorporated ingredients, you have to start calling it a honey flavored syrup rather than just straight honey. So curious what your take is on that.
That's what we've found too. So if it's pure honey, no scheduled process required, but as soon as you add something to it, usually the inspector is going to request that, because whatever you're adding to it could bring additional risk. We've gotten things, not as much the honey stick, but like herb infused honeys or hot pepper infused honeys, things like that, where those things can carry other biological risks to them as well. So as soon as, I don't know exactly what you're putting in the sticks, but usually that's going to require a scheduled process because they'll be stored room temperature again. So you want to make sure that they're commercially sterile once you start adding stuff to it. Honey itself is like totally safe, heard all about how you can find honey hundreds of years old and it's still fine. But when you add stuff to it, it changes.
Great. All right. Well, if there's not any other questions left, then we thank you, Cynthia, for giving such a great presentation tonight. This has been fantastic, really informative. And yeah, just thanks to everyone else for coming and joining us tonight. And we hope you have a great evening.
Great. My pleasure. I'll send you the PDF so you can share with anyone who wants it then.
Great.
Right.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
a lot, Cynthia.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.